Sophie sat alone in the bridal suite, her hands trembling as she adjusted the delicate veil cascading down her shoulders. Outside, she could hear the faint murmur of guests waiting, their laughter a cruel reminder of the days she had dreamed of. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, a union with Ethan, the man she believed was her soulmate. But something felt wrong. The ceremony was delayed, and whispers began to ripple through the venue. "He's probably just running late," her best friend Lily reassured, though even she didn't sound convinced. Minutes turned into an eternity. Then the door opened and the priest walked in, his somber expression confirming Sophie's worst fears. "I'm sorry, Miss Sophie," he said gently. "Ethan won't be coming." The words shattered Sophie's world. Her heart raced as tears blurred her vision. Unbeknownst to Sophie, Ethan sat nearby in his car, watching her through the window. His mother's words echoed in his head. "This marriage will ruin you, Ethan. Focus on your career." Overwhelmed by guilt, Ethan stayed silent, unaware that this moment would haunt him for years to come. The church was silent, except for the faint whispers of confused guests as Sophie stood, frozen in her white gown. Her heart pounded as her world crumbled around her. The humiliation was unbearable, but the pain was even greater. She had been so sure of Ethan, of their future together, yet now she was left to pick up the shattered pieces of her life. 2 weeks before the wedding, there had been signs, subtle ones, but Sophie had ignored them. She recalled Ethan's distant demeanor during a quiet dinner at her apartment. As he held her hand, he asked, "Are you sure this is what you want?" "Of course I do," Sophie replied, confused. "We love each other, don't we?" Ethan gave her a fragile smile that now, in hindsight, felt more like a warning. She hadn't realized the weight of his inner turmoil, nor the influence his mother had over him. Sophie collapsed onto the curb outside the church, tears streaming down her face. Her thoughts spiraled. Why didn't he show up? Did I do something wrong? Across the street, hidden in his car, Ethan sat, gripping his steering wheel. His mother's sharp voice replayed in his mind. "She'll hold you back, Ethan. She's not right for our family." Torn between his love for Sophie and the expectations his family had for him, Ethan had made his choice. The next morning, Sophie packed her belongings and left the city without a word to anyone. She didn't say goodbye to friends, didn't confront Ethan, and didn't even look back. She boarded a bus with nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart. The first few months were grueling. Sophie settled in a small town, renting a modest room and taking up a teaching position at the local elementary school. Her days were long and exhausting, but she buried herself in work, desperate to forget the humiliation and heartbreak. Still, the memories lingered. Nights were the hardest. She would stare at the ceiling, replaying the events leading up to that fateful day. Every laugh they had shared, every promise Ethan had made, it all felt like a cruel joke now. One evening, as she closed her classroom after a long day, Sophie felt an unexplainable wave of fatigue. For weeks, she had been feeling off. Nausea in the mornings, constant exhaustion, and a strange fluttering in her stomach. After much hesitation, she bought a pregnancy test and stared at the result that changed everything. Positive. Her breath caught as a mix of fear and resolve washed over her. I'm going to be a mother. For the first time in months, Sophie felt a glimmer of hope, but her journey had only just begun. The test in Sophie's trembling hand felt heavier than it should. She stared at the 2 pink lines, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. A baby. No, 4 babies, she later learned during her first ultrasound appointment. The doctor's calm tone echoed in her mind. Congratulations, Sophie, you're expecting quadruplets. Her first reaction was disbelief. 4? Are you sure? She had asked, her voice barely audible. Yes, 4 healthy heartbeats, the doctor confirmed with a kind smile. Sophie left the clinic in a daze. She was still recovering from the heartbreak Ethan had left behind, and now she was faced with an entirely new reality. But as overwhelming as it seemed, she knew one thing for certain. These children were hers, and she would do whatever it took to provide them with a good life. The small room she rented was no longer sufficient. Using her meager savings, Sophie found a modest house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, a worn roof, peeling paint, and creaky floors. But it had space for her growing family. She spent her evenings fixing it up, painting walls, and assembling cribs she had bought secondhand. Her pregnancy wasn't easy. Carrying 4 babies was both physically and emotionally taxing. Some days she could barely stand long enough to teach her students, but she pushed through. She spent her nights preparing for the future, reading every parenting book she could find, and budgeting down to the last cent. As Sophie's belly grew, so did her determination. She avoided thinking about Ethan, burying herself in her preparations. Still, she couldn't stop wondering, if he knew, would he care? The months passed faster than she expected. Soon, the day came when she was rushed to the hospital. The delivery was complicated, but Sophie refused to give in to fear. When she finally held her babies, 4 tiny bundles of life, she was overcome with emotion. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered their names: Emma, Grace, Lily, and Nora. Each girl was unique, even in those early moments. Emma let out a loud wail, making her presence known. Grace's quiet gaze seemed to take in the world around her. Lily's tiny fingers grabbed Sophie's hand with surprising strength, and Nora, the smallest of the 4, nestled against her chest with a calm demeanor. The weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights, diaper changes, and constant feedings. Sophie quickly learned that raising quadruplets on her own was an all-consuming task. There were moments of sheer exhaustion when she wondered how she would make it through another day. But there were also moments of joy: Emma's first smile, Lily's contagious giggles, and the way Grace and Nora held on to each other as if they already shared an unbreakable bond. Her modest house transformed into a home filled with warmth, chaos, and laughter. Sophie's colleagues at the school marveled at her resilience, often lending a hand when she needed it most. Through it all, Sophie remained fiercely independent. She told herself that she didn't need anyone else, least of all Ethan. But deep down, the question lingered. Would he ever regret leaving? Would he ever know about the 4 lives he helped create? As the years passed, Sophie built a life for her family. She juggled teaching, parenting, and countless sleepless nights with an unyielding determination. Her daughters grew into curious, energetic toddlers, each with a personality as vibrant as their mother's strength. 5 years passed, and Sophie's life revolved around her daughters, Emma, Grace, Lily, and Nora. Their house was always filled with laughter and the occasional chaos that came with raising 4 spirited little girls. Each of them had a distinct personality. Emma, the leader, was always ready to take charge. Grace, the quiet and thoughtful one, loved her books. Lily was the jokester, always coming up with ways to make her sisters laugh. And Nora, the baby of the group, was gentle but fiercely independent. Sophie worked tirelessly as a teacher to provide for them, juggling her career and motherhood without complaint. Every moment spent with her daughters was worth the exhaustion, and their happiness gave her strength. One sunny afternoon, Sophie decided to take the girls to the park for a well-deserved break. As they raced toward the playground, Sophie settled onto a bench, keeping a watchful eye on them. She smiled as Emma led her sisters toward the swings, their laughter ringing through the air. But then, she froze. Across the park, sitting on another bench, was Ethan. His gaze was fixed on the girls, and the resemblance was unmistakable. Sophie's heart raced. She hadn't seen him since the day he abandoned her, and now, here he was, watching their daughters. Ethan's expression changed when their eyes met. He looked shocked, almost unsure of himself. Sophie's first instinct was to grab her girls and leave before he could approach. "Emma, Grace, Lily, Nora, it's time to go home," she called, her voice louder than usual. The girls groaned, protesting in unison. "But we just got here, Mommy," Emma complained, her arms crossed. "Now please," Sophie insisted, her tone firm. She began gathering their belongings, her mind racing. But before she could leave, Ethan approached. His voice stopped her in her tracks. "Sophie?" She turned slowly, meeting his gaze. "Ethan," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. He glanced at the girls who were still playing, then back at Sophie. Sophie's gaze shifted to her daughters, her heart tightening as she thought of everything she had endured to protect them. Finally, she met Ethan's eyes, her voice steady but cold. "Yes, Ethan, they're yours." Ethan's breath hitched, and he ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Sophie remembered all too well. He looked at the girls again, his face a mixture of shock and guilt. "Why didn't you tell me?" "You left me," Sophie said firmly, crossing her arms. "I was humiliated, abandoned, and pregnant. What was I supposed to do?" Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but closed it again, his guilt evident. He finally said, "I need to meet them, Sophie. I need to be part of their lives." Sophie took a step back, shielding her daughters with her presence. "It's not that simple, Ethan. You don't just get to show up and decide you're a father now." Sophie's heart sank as Ethan's determination became clear. A few days after their encounter at the park, she received a formal notice. Ethan had filed for joint custody of their daughters. The past she had fought to bury was now dragging her back into a storm she wasn't prepared for. Sitting at her kitchen table, Sophie clutched the letter with trembling hands. Across from her sat Amelia, her longtime friend and a skilled attorney. "We'll fight this, Sophie," Amelia assured her. "He might have resources, but you have something he doesn't. A proven history of being there for your girls." Sophie nodded, but felt the weight of the battle pressing down on her. The thought of having to share her daughters, even with their father, was unbearable. When the court date arrived, Sophie walked into the packed courtroom, her head held high. Amelia was at her side, her presence steady and reassuring. Across the room sat Ethan, flanked by his lawyer and, to Sophie's disdain, Stella. Ethan's former fiancée, now seemingly involved in his legal battle. Ethan's lawyer painted a picture of a man ready to make amends. He emphasized Ethan's financial stability, his ability to provide opportunities for the girls, and his genuine desire to be part of their lives. Sophie clenched her fists under the table. It was easy to make promises, but she had been the one raising Emma, Grace, Lily, and Nora, sacrificing everything to ensure they were happy and healthy. When it was Amelia's turn, she spoke with passion. "Your Honor, my client has been the sole caregiver for these children since birth. She has faced every challenge with resilience, providing them with love, stability, and an emotionally secure environment. Mr. Ethan may have the means, but raising children requires more than money. It requires heart, sacrifice, and an unwavering presence." The judge listened intently, but the tension in the room was palpable. Sophie's heart pounded as Ethan took the stand. Amelia didn't hold back. "Mr. Ethan, can you explain why you chose to leave Sophie 5 years ago?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I was pressured by my mother. She convinced me that marriage and a family would ruin my career," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "And Stella?" Amelia pressed. "Did she play a role in that decision?" Ethan hesitated, glancing at Stella, who sat stiffly, her expression unreadable. "She supported my mother's decision," he admitted reluctantly. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Sophie's anger flared. The betrayal she had suspected all those years was now confirmed. But Amelia wasn't finished. She called an unexpected witness, Morgan, the former housekeeper for Ethan's family. Morgan, an elderly woman with a cane, took the stand and recounted the manipulations she had witnessed. Ethan's mother controlled everything, and Stella encouraged it. They both believed Sophie wasn't good enough for their family. The revelation sent shockwaves through the room. Ethan's face turned pale, his hands clenching into fists as he processed the betrayal. Stella, meanwhile, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her confident demeanor cracking under the weight of Morgan's words. "That's not true," Stella blurted, standing abruptly. The judge banged his gavel for order. When the session adjourned, Ethan approached Sophie in the hallway. "Sophie, I didn't know. I didn't realize how much they'd manipulated me," he said quietly. Sophie shook her head, her voice cold. "You still made your choice, Ethan, and I had to pick up the pieces." The judge's final ruling came days later. Sophie would retain primary custody, while Ethan would be granted supervised visitation rights to build a relationship with the girls. In the weeks following the court's decision, Ethan began using his visitation rights to spend time with Emma, Grace, Lily, and Nora. Initially, Sophie kept a close watch, her guard firmly in place. She didn't trust that Ethan's intentions were entirely selfless, and her priority was protecting her daughters. To her surprise, Ethan approached the situation with patience and humility. Instead of overwhelming the girls with grand gestures, he focused on the little things. He brought thoughtful gifts, like a set of storybooks for Grace, puzzles for Emma, a sketch pad for Lily, and a dollhouse for Nora. At first, the girls were hesitant. They clung to Sophie, unsure of how to react to the man who was suddenly part of their lives. But Ethan didn't push. He listened when Grace told him about her favorite books, cheered as Emma showed him how high she could swing, and sat on the floor helping Lily and Nora build a tea party with their dolls. One afternoon, Ethan brought a kite to the park and invited the girls to join him. The wind was perfect, and their laughter filled the air as they raced across the grass, trying to keep the kite in the sky. Sophie watched from a bench, her arms crossed, but her expression softening as she saw Ethan genuinely enjoying time with his daughters. Emma, always the leader, managed to keep the kite flying the longest. Ethan swept her up in a playful hug, making her giggle uncontrollably. Grace tugged on Sophie's sleeve, asking, "Mommy, is he staying with us now?" The question caught Sophie off guard. She didn't have an answer, but realized how quickly the girls were beginning to trust Ethan. Over time, Ethan's efforts became harder to ignore. He showed up consistently, remembered the girls' favorite snacks, and even began helping Sophie with their school projects. He celebrated Grace's accomplishments in reading, encouraged Lily's creativity, and gently guided Nora when she hesitated to try new things. One evening, as Sophie tucked the girls into bed, Emma whispered, "Mommy, I like Daddy. He's funny." Sophie froze. She hadn't heard them call him Daddy before, but Emma's words carried an innocence she couldn't deny. After the girls fell asleep, Sophie found Ethan sitting in the living room, flipping through a photo album he had brought. He had been sharing pictures from his childhood with the girls earlier that day. "Thank you for letting me be part of their lives," Ethan said softly, not looking up. Sophie hesitated before replying. "They're happy. That's all that matters." She wanted to keep her guard up, but it was becoming harder. Ethan's sincerity was evident, and for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. One morning, Ethan arrived with tools and wood. He had promised the girls they would build a small playhouse together. The backyard was soon filled with the sound of hammering and laughter as the girls painted the wood in bright colors. Sophie watched from the porch, a faint smile tugging at her lips. This was more than a playhouse. It was a symbol of something bigger, a fragile but growing bond between Ethan and their daughters. Yet Sophie remained cautious. As much as Ethan seemed to have changed, she couldn't forget the years of pain he had caused. But for now, she chose to focus on the present, on the joy her daughters felt. As months passed, Ethan's presence in his daughters' lives became steady and reliable. Emma, Grace, Lily, and Nora fully embraced him as part of their routine, bonding with him over shared activities. Sophie, however, remained cautious, guarding her heart despite his consistent efforts. Ethan wasn't just visiting, he was helping. He picked the girls up from school, repaired things around the house, and became an active part of their daily lives. One evening, while they tidied the kitchen together, he spoke softly. I've missed so much, Sophie. I know I can't change the past, but I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere. Sophie responded cautiously. It's not about showing up, it's about staying. Ethan nodded, his actions continuing to prove his resolve. One weekend, Ethan planned a picnic for the family. The girls laughed and played in the open fields, while Sophie and Ethan sat under a tree. Sophie, he began nervously, I still love you. I'm not asking for forgiveness, just a chance to show I've changed. Sophie hesitated, unsure if she could trust him fully. But as she watched their daughters laughing, she allowed herself to wonder, could they rebuild something better than before? Over the following months, Sophie and Ethan's relationship evolved from cautious cooperation to something deeper. Small gestures, shared dinners, late-night talks, and Ethan stepping up as a father laid the groundwork for a new connection. One sunny afternoon, Ethan surprised Sophie and the girls with a trip to a flower-filled meadow. While the girls ran through the blossoms, Ethan led Sophie to a secluded spot. I've been thinking about this for a long time, he began, pulling out a small box. You've shown me what love truly means. Not just for me, but for our daughters. Sophie, will you marry me? Sophie stared at the ring, her emotions overwhelming. She had imagined this moment once, long ago, but now it carried new meaning. After a deep breath, she smiled. Yes, Ethan. The girls, noticing the scene, ran toward them, squealing with joy. Mommy, are we going to be a family again? Emma asked excitedly. Yes, my loves, Sophie said, embracing them. We're going to be a family. The months that followed were filled with laughter and preparations for their wedding. On a bright spring day, Sophie and Ethan exchanged vows in a simple garden ceremony, surrounded by loved ones. The girls played special roles, carrying flowers and rings, adding their joyful energy to the day. As the family danced under twinkling lights that evening, Sophie felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Together, they had overcome heartbreak, fear, and doubt to build something beautiful. A family bound by love, resilience, and the courage to start again.